Добрий вечір, це Павло Шеремета з економічним проривом. It is my great pleasure to host Professor Fukuyama tonight in this studio for the first time, actually. But it's not the first time, Professor, that you are in Ukraine. And many people that hear that you're coming, they keep me asking, why so often is he in Ukraine? Why so often are you in Ukraine? We are happy to see you every time, but you're quite often here. Why?
Well, first of all, Pavlo, it's a great pleasure to be on this interview with you. And I'm really delighted to be back in Ukraine. I've felt for the last several years that Ukraine is really one of the most important countries in the world in terms of an overall struggle for democracy. After Maidan, after Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14, Ukraine really became the frontline country in the struggle between the forces of Putinism, which I would say is a combination of populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism, and a European model of liberal democracy. And I think that the success of Ukraine matters way beyond Ukraine itself. I mean, Ukraine is a big and important country in its own right, but I think that the rest of the region is watching how this country goes and whether it can actually make a transition to being a really modern country. And if it fails, I think it's going to be very discouraging for the entire region. I think that Russia is doing everything it can to undermine this country. On the other hand, if it succeeds, I think it'll serve as a beacon of hope for many other parts of Europe and the world beyond. So that's why I'm particularly interested in returning here.
And again, I mean, I have no words enough to thank you for that commitment, Professor. And your contribution is very important and very much appreciated here. Thank you very much. Now, you mentioned, you said if it fails or if it succeeds. I mean, like this is your third or fourth time over 2 years or something. Now, what's your mood? I mean, are we succeeding or are we failing?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think actually every time I've come away more optimistic than simply observing Ukraine from the outside because I meet a lot of young reformers, people that really want to change Ukraine. These are the people I work with and I'm trying to reach out to. And I find them very inspiring, but, they're real challenges. So I think up to this point, Ukraine has actually made quite a lot of important reforms in the economic sphere. So the reform of the gas market was important. The stabilization of the banking system and the work of the central bank, I think, was all important. There's still a lot to be done in that respect. I think the problem now is in issues like corruption and in the capacity of the state to actually deliver the quality of services that Ukrainians hope and expect. I think that there's an awareness that the Orange Revolution failed because that government could not deliver. It couldn't deliver on the basic promises of a democracy, and that's why you had the return to power of Yanukovych. And so it's important that legacy not repeat itself here. So there's reason for optimism and I think reasons to be cautious as well.
Professor, how do you explain, if I can say so, from kind of this helicopter view? We started with Poland in 1991 from approximately the same position. Now Poland is so far ahead, as well as Estonia and Slovakia and Czech Republic and Hungary to the large extent. At least economically. Now, what's wrong with Ukraine?
Well, I think it really is the historical origins of Ukraine. Ukraine was first part of the Russian Empire and then an integral part of the Soviet Union, compared to Poland, which had something like an independent, agricultural sector. It had a civil society, even in the period under communism, where you had groups like Solidarity, the famous labor union that grew up under communism. Ukraine had none of these things, and all of this had to be created. An independent civil society had to emerge only after 1991. And I think there's also a cultural element. I think that there was a very heavy generational embedding of a kind of nomenclatura left over from the Soviet Union that had a Soviet way of thinking that was much deeper than in Eastern Europe. So that's why I think the change has been slower. The other thing is that because Poland and these other countries that you mentioned were able to join the European Union, they had a direct incentive to change their institutions. They got a lot of direct help. And I think also a matter of physical geography makes a difference. So Poland is right next to Germany. It's connected to European markets much more easily than Ukraine. So for all of these reasons, I think that explains the slowness of Ukraine.
In your book, Political Order and Political Decay, you say that there are three building blocks that are required for a well-ordered society: a strong state, the rule of law, and democratic accountability. And you need them all together. And what matters is getting the sequence right. So basically, democracy doesn't come first. A strong state does. So explaining Poland and other Central European countries, can we make a judgment that it's basically they first strengthened its institutions through the European Union, and that gave them kind of leadway in comparison to Ukraine that basically started with democracy first and now is only trying to strengthen the institutions?
I'm not sure that the sequencing is really the cause of the problem. I think it's more the nature of the state that, when you use the word strong state, in Russian, my book, State Building, was translated Silnaya Gosudarstva, and in Russian, that has a connotation of police and, the heavy hand of an authoritarian dictator. That's not what I mean by a strong state. What I mean by a strong state is a state that's effective in delivering basic services, infrastructure, health, education, and it needs to do that without corruption, so that civil servants, bureaucrats believe that they're working on behalf of the public as a whole, that they've got public interest in mind before their own personal interest. That's what a strong state means. And I think that, again, Ukraine was hobbled by the fact that, yes, the Soviet Union had a strong state and I work with and I'm trying to reach out to, and I find them very inspiring. But, they're real challenges. So I think up to this point, Ukraine has actually made quite a lot of important reforms in the economic sphere. So the reform of the gas market was important. The stabilization of the banking system and the work of the central bank, I think, was all important. There's still a lot to be done in that respect. I think the problem now is in issues like corruption and in the capacity of the state to actually deliver the quality of services that Ukrainians hope and expect. I think that there's an awareness that the Orange Revolution failed because that government could not deliver. It couldn't deliver on the basic promises of a democracy, and that's why you had the return to power of Yanukovych. And so it's important that legacy not repeat itself here. So there's reason for optimism and I think reasons to be cautious as well.
Professor, how do you explain, if I can say so, from kind of this helicopter view? We started with Poland in 1991 from approximately the same position. Now Poland is so far ahead, as well as Estonia and Slovakia and Czech Republic and Hungary to the large extent, at least economically. Now, what's wrong with Ukraine?
Well, I think it really is the historical origins of Ukraine. Ukraine was first part of the Russian Empire and then an integral part of the Soviet Union, compared to Poland, which had something like an independent, agricultural sector. It had a civil society, even in the period under communism, where you had groups like Solidarity, the famous labor union that grew up under communism. Ukraine had none of these things, and all of this had to be created. An independent civil society had to emerge only after 1991. And I think there's also a cultural element. I think that there is a very heavy generational embedding of a kind of nomenclatura left over from the Soviet Union that had a Soviet way of thinking that was much deeper than in Eastern Europe. So that's why I think the change has been slower. The other thing is that because Poland and these other countries that you mentioned were able to join the European Union, they had a direct incentive to change their institutions. They got a lot of direct help. And I think also a matter of physical geography makes a difference. So Poland is right next to Germany. It's connected to European markets much more easily than Ukraine. So for all of these reasons, I think that explains the slowness of Ukraine.
In your book, Political Order and Political Decay, you say that there are three building blocks that are required for a well-ordered society. A strong state, the rule of law, and democratic accountability. And you need them all together. And what matters is getting the sequence right. So basically, democracy doesn't come first. A strong state does. So explaining Poland and other Central European countries, can we make a judgment that it's basically they first strengthened its institutions through the European Union, and that gave them kind of lead away in comparison to Ukraine that basically started with democracy first and now is only trying to strengthen the institutions?
I'm not sure that the sequencing is really the cause of the problem. I think it's more the nature of the state that, when you use the word strong state, in Russian, my book, State Building, was translated Silnaya Gasudarstva, and in Russian, that has a connotation of police and, the heavy hand of an authoritarian dictator. That's not what I mean by a strong state. What I mean by a strong state is a state that's effective in delivering basic services, infrastructure, health, education, and it needs to do that without corruption, so that civil servants, bureaucrats believe that they're working on behalf of the public as a whole, that they've got public interest in mind before their own personal interest. That's what a strong state means. And I think that, again, Ukraine was hobbled by the fact that, yes, the Soviet Union had a strong state in the sense of police and the repressive ability of the state to suppress dissent and this sort of thing, but it didn't have a strong state in terms of the ability to elicit voluntary cooperation, to deliver services in a clean way. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the levels of corruption went up, and that's still part of the legacy here, I think, in Ukraine.
You travel all around the world. You advise different governments, including in Southeast Asia and Latin America. So corruption in Ukraine is not an unusual phenomena, but it probably is so rampant that it becomes unusual, at least in our view. What would be your advice? You mentioned that already a couple of times, the issue of corruption. How should we fight corruption?
Well, corruption is really a political matter. The reason that you have pervasive corruption in societies like Ukraine is that it is in the interest of corrupt people to keep the status quo, to keep things the way they are because they benefit from it. And so ultimately it becomes a political struggle that you have to replace this layer of corrupt politicians and officials with people that really want to serve a public interest. And that's a fight that can really take a very long time because, corruption in a sense is self-reinforcing. People serve their own interests through bribes and rent-seeking, and that gives them more power to hold on to their positions. And so things like elections are very important. You're going to have some elections coming up in Ukraine in the coming year or two. And I think the choices that people make in those elections will be very important because you want to have a new set of leaders that are not going to be heirs of this corrupt system.
In the same book, you introduced the concept of repatrimonialization. And that means that the small groups and networks, families, corporations use their inside knowledge of how power works to work it to their own advantage. That was actually my challenge. My challenge in the government is that we did not change the ways it was run. It was still, old ways. And obviously you have the specialists, the experts, in many ways, pretty corrupt, but they know how the system works. and the system is not changed. And then, on the other hand, if you want to change the system, that may weaken the state, and we are in the situation of the war. How do you reconcile it all together?
Well, first of all, I think that it requires a rebuilding of the state machinery. You have to have a different kind of civil service with people that have different kinds of training and different kinds of moral attitudes towards public service, where they really do have something like public interest in mind. That's part of, I think, what I try to do when I'm in Ukraine, because I feel like the only contribution I can make is to training an entirely new generation of leaders. And I think they need to form a network, they need to cooperate with one another, they need to build coalitions and gradually displace people with a different kind of mindset. I think that's ultimately what needs to be done. A lot of it is a matter of education. You need people not just with the right technical education, but with this professional sense of public service.
With your help, I know that the Stanford University runs this the program for Ukrainian reformers. We're already 1 year into the program. Can you share your impressions?
Well,
Please.
it's a very inspiring program. I mean, we actually have several programs that have involved Ukraine, where we alternatively bring people to Stanford, or else we teach programs here in Ukraine. I think that what our Emerging Leaders program allows young Ukrainian reformers to do is to step back from their daily lives, where they're overwhelmed with short-term concerns, and develop a more theoretical and conceptual framework for how to think about Ukraine, how to place it in the context of other countries that are going through similar kinds of challenges. They meet new people, and hopefully will go back to Ukraine with different ideas of how to approach the problems of their own country.
And we have some very successful reformers there indeed. Like, for example, my very good friend, Alexander Starodubtsev, whom I introduced in 2014 as a co-leader of the working group cleaning up the procurement system.
No, that's right. And Sasha has been, I think, quite inspired. He's met people in the Silicon Valley and the tech community there, so that he can place Prozoro in a larger context of technology that's useful for transparency and the like.
And I know that you're selecting now the next cohort of the students. I mean, it's the Stanford selects, right? I mean,
Yes, that's right.
There's the application process going on.
Yes.
Is the deadline done for the?
The deadline's done for the coming year, but we have funding to keep this program going for the next several years. So we're looking forward to several more generations of emerging leaders. And
we also know that Slavko Vakarchuk is there.
He was, yes, he was.
Good, and we hope to have him in the studio as well a bit later. Thank you, Professor. We will come back after the news, so please do not switch. Okay, we continue with Professor Fukuyama here in the studio of NV Radio. And we just started a discussion about the training for the Ukrainian reformers, and it's almost a 1 year program for very select and very advanced, very few, but very important Ukrainian reformers at Stanford. Now, there's a larger group convening for the fourth time this week. In Kiev, you will have 40 reformers with you for 5 days. Who are these people, and what are you going to discuss with them?
Well, I started a program maybe about 10 years ago called the Leadership Academy for Development. The idea is that we want to reach people that are largely public officials in either developing or transitioning countries. So these are usually people in their 30s or 40s that have already demonstrated leadership potential. They're running offices. Sometimes they're in civil society. A lot of times they're running government agencies. And the idea is to give them a set of skills to actually be able to implement reform. A lot of times you have this beautiful idea of what a reform ought to look like, but you're unable to actually accomplish it in the real world because a lot of the training that's typically given is very technocratic in nature. There's an important point to having technical skills, but oftentimes what you need is a broader view of how to actually change things in the real world. And that's what our Leadership Academy seeks to do. We use cases. We've written cases that focus on particular leaders in other countries facing similar kinds of challenges. And I think what we're trying to do is communicate a way of thinking about leadership strategy. What do leaders do? How do they communicate? How do they build coalitions? And how do they actually implement things in the real world? So we've done over 30 of these programs. Will be the fourth in Ukraine, thanks to the Ukrainian Catholic University, which it's been a very good partner for us in all of these, and we're really looking forward to the fourth and last of these programs. Well, hopefully not the last, but the fourth
most recent,
most recent of these programs.
The most current. Great. And I'm so happy that we had the chance to develop the thinking and idea of that back in Tbilisi a bit more than 2 years ago, and also for the National Endowment for Democracy support and SIPE Ukraine support and SIPE Global. That all of them help us, to have this week together. Now, I know that the topic of this particular Leadership Academy for Development in Ukraine is stakeholder analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you spend 5 days on stakeholder analysis?
Well, stakeholder analysis is just a name for learning how to think systematically about politics. A stakeholder is anybody who has some interest in the outcome of a particular policy reform that you're trying to do. Some of the stakeholders will support you, others will be completely opposed, and others are going to be neutral. And if you're actually going to get something done in the real world, what you have to do is think about what are the constraints and the obstacles to actually making the change that you want to make. And that's why the stakeholder analysis is important, because what it forces you to do is to think, who is with me? Who benefits from this? Who can I persuade to come over to my side? And then you also need to think systematically about those that are opposed. And so, in many cases, you have entrenched interests, you have corrupt politicians, you have bureaucrats or parts of the bureaucracy that simply don't want things done otherwise. And you need to think very strategically about how you build a coalition in favor of the kind of change that you want to do. So, really, this is not, as they say, this is not rocket science. This is not nuclear physics. I think almost any successful politician performs a kind of stakeholder analysis if they're a clever and successful politician, because this is the stuff of politics. But I think that many people with a technical background haven't learned to think this way. And so what we're trying to do is to encourage them to think about stakeholders and think about how they can, work in a social and a political environment.
The challenge again that I had when I was in the government was that the opposing interests are so powerful and so concentrated, and supporting stakeholders are so dispersed and so in many ways inactive, that you do need a lot of efforts in terms of communication, in terms of coalition building, as you mentioned, in terms of political skills, to amplify the positive forces against the negative forces. And even then, you have so much threats and dangers.
Well, that's right. So, that's why politics is hard, and I think that's why change is hard. I think that the particular skills that are necessary are things like communication, because sometimes you don't realize that you have more support out there than you might think at first. And unless you can communicate your goals and you can communicate them persuasively, you're not going to get people on your side. Sometimes it's a problem of collective action and organization. So, a collective action problem is something in economics where a group of people have a common interest in accomplishing something, but they don't have a way of coordinating their activity. A typical case of this is, if you're trying to reform a school system, children and their parents are the stakeholders that are the most important, but typically they don't work together, whereas the bureaucrats and the teachers, are usually organized, very well organized. And so, you need to communicate and you need to be able to organize. And I think those are parts of what's necessary to actually perform a successful reform.
When you said that this is not a rocket science, I repeat this phrase in the Ukrainian city 140 kilometers from here called Zhytomyr. You will have a participant from that city, maybe even few of them in your program. That's the place where Sergei Korolev was born, who designed the rocket. So I would tell them that, look, and you mastered it. It's not a rocket science, and you mastered it. So it's worse, it's more difficult, And also, following Alexander Starodubtsev from Stanford, he rarely shares, as you mentioned, technocratic messages and ideas from Stanford. Mm-hmm. It's mostly about change management. It's mostly about communication. And I think that our universities and the schools of public administration and business administration need to be stronger in that. So I think that your help and Stanford Center for Democracy and Rule of Law is so important in strengthening this.
Well, I think that's right. Public policy in the United States is mostly training people to be policy analysts, and so you equip them with powerful quantitative skills to come up with what the best policy is, but then you get out into the real world and you realize that you can't implement the best policy because there are too many people that don't want that policy in the first place. And so we try to go beyond that, and that's, I think, why the case method is important, because that really puts you in the position of other decision makers, other leaders that have faced similar kinds of problems.
I know that you also have a high-level meeting with the Prime Minister and the Secretary to the government.
Yes.
And reformers.
Yes.
So these are already people acting in the government, which I believe is very good that you're dealing with them too. What's your overall message? You have many friends among young Ukrainian reformers, and I know that you encourage and pushed even probably some of them to enter politics. And I saw them the last week, some of them,
Mm-hmm.
They're so burnt over. They're so tired. I mean,
Yes.
they're still excited,
Mm-hmm.
but now not in the corruption sense, of course, of the word, but now they got their hands dirty
Mm-hmm.
with real politics, and they're not that idealistic any longer. Was that the purpose?
Well, Ukraine has a very strong civil society. It's very impressive. There are many people that really were responsible for the revolution of dignity that pushed the government, monitored it, and then forced changes from the outside. But the point that I've tried to make to my civil society friends is that once you actually make that transition and you have an opportunity to create a real democracy, you can't do that from civil society. I mean, the civil society continues to be very important, but democracy is also about the actual exercise of power. And if all the people on the inside are corrupt or incompetent or have the wrong ideas, you're never going to have a successful democracy. And so that's why I think I've been encouraging my friends on the outside to go into government and yes, to get their hands dirty. Now, it's a long process, and I think the problem is that there's not enough of them. They need to build their own networks, and they also need the experience of this exercise of power. And that's the only way over time that Ukraine will actually have good government.
Is this only the network that they need to build, or it's also the organization they need to build? Because frankly,
it's both. Yeah, it's both. I mean, you need there are several things that Ukraine needs. So, for example, it needs a strong political party that's a reformist party. One of the big problems in many former communist countries is that you had many people that were basically liberal reformers. They wanted a European-style politics, but they couldn't work together. And so you need a reformist party that can gather all of these people, into one block. And then you need people that have the technocratic skills and the policy program and so they know what they need to implement once they're in government. And then you need people that have the political skills to actually bring that about. And they need to be able to work together on the inside. So all of these things are slowly happening. But I don't think that, the fact that it hasn't happened in the 4 years since the Revolution of Dignity shouldn't be overly discouraging, because if you look at the United States or Britain or France or other countries that have done this sort of thing, this is a work of a generation or two. So, Ukraine is only at the start of this process.
Which I would say is a very Oriental, in my opinion, point of view. I mean, I lived there, for 3+ years, so I know that this generation, next generation type of thinking is very prevalent there. And by the way, and I support it. I like it. Here, although we're saying there is no one I can vote for in 2019, which is next year.
Well, we'll have to see.
Good. So will you be talking about this with your friends, reformers here as well, encouraging them to build the organization?
Yes. Well, I think that's one of the things. So the way we teach is not that I stand up there and I give them instructions. I mean, this is really not all that helpful. I think that's actually a kind of Soviet way of lecturing. That's why we do cases, because I think what you want to do is look at other examples of leadership in other parts of the world and how things have succeeded. Not that you copy them slavishly, but that it gives you ideas about how you can exercise leadership in your own society, because, really every society is different. The conditions in Ukraine are quite different from those of Singapore, of India, or, other places in the world. And what you need is somebody that is aware of those specific historical traditions and culture and who the actors are, but can still think strategically to put all of them together into a strategy for reform.
Which we will discuss in the last portion of our program. Thank you very much. It's Professor Fukuyama with us in our studio, and we will continue after the news and the weather forecast. Stay with us, please. Okay, and that's the third and the last portion of our interview here with Professor Fukuyama. Professor, we see the rise of populism all around the world. You mentioned, when you were talking about Ukraine, you mentioned about European values, and something that I have in my head is actually Hungary is Europe too, and Poland is Europe too, and UK Independence Party is still Europe too. Mm-hmm. I'm not even mentioning about the US. What's going on in the world? Why do we have this threat of and not only threat, but it's rise of populism all around the world?
Well, it's a very disturbing phenomenon. I think what's happening is that democratically elected leaders are using that democratic legitimacy to undermine the rule of law and the other kinds of institutions that make up a true liberal democracy. A lot of this is driven by economics, because in many cases, there are people that have not benefited from economic growth. A lot of it is cultural fear. So in Hungary and Poland, I think they've seen images of refugees streaming into Germany or into their own countries back in 2014-15, and they want to protect a certain sense of national identity that they feel that they've inherited. And so the problem with this is that it's given legitimacy to attempts to undermine the rule of law, meaning the independence of judicial institutions. So both Hungary and Poland, the leading political party has politicized the judiciary so that judges won't act as an obstacle to anything that they want to do. They have tended to consolidate power in the office of a single president so that you don't have the kinds of checks and balances that you should have in a well-functioning democracy. And I think you're seeing the rise of a kind of ethnic nationalism. So, for example, Viktor Orban in Hungary has said very clearly that he believes that Hungarian national identity is based on Hungarian ethnicity, which, is one way of defining national identity, except that there are many non-Hungarians who live in Hungary, and there are also lots of ethnic Hungarians that live outside of Hungary. And if you recall, this was exactly the conditions that led to the rise of National Socialism in Germany, where, you had this fellow named Adolf Hitler that said that German identity was based on German ethnicity. So these are very dangerous ideas, really, that are now being heard for the first time. I guess one further thing to say is that I think that the passage of time has also empowered this kind of politician. You had a generation that grew up under communism, and they could remember how bad that was. But now most of the people living in Eastern Europe were born after the fall of communism. They don't have the memory of what it was like to live under this kind of authoritarian government. And so they can complain about the European Union, and they can complain about, the short-sightedness of their current politicians, and forget that there are dangers. There are really nasty kinds of regimes out there and they're playing with fire when they deal with some of these very illiberal ideas.
And in that context, we would usually have the leading role of your country, the United States of America, leading by example, leading by values, promoting the freedom values all around the world, and it's not happening during the last year or two. Sometimes when I hear the American and the Chinese leader, whom you met, by the way, Xi Jinping, Mr. Xi seems to be more liberal, more open, trade-oriented than the U.S. president. What is going on?
Well, I don't make any secret of the fact that I didn't vote for Donald Trump, and I think he's been a terrible president. He's really the first president in my memory who has never said anything about the importance of democracy around the world. Most American presidents believe that the United States really has a mission to support a democratic ideal and to support other democracies. And Donald Trump has done just the opposite. He's picked fights with Angela Merkel and with Justin Trudeau and, the president of Mexico. All these other democratic countries. And he has expressed admiration for General Sisi in Egypt, for Vladimir Putin, for, Chairman Xi, as you mentioned. He seems to like these strongmen, authoritarian-type leaders, and I think it sets a terrible example. The other thing that's going on with him is that he is trying to undermine the independence of the American rule of law, because there's this investigation of his own relationship with Russia going on. He doesn't like it. And just like, all these other populist leaders, he's attacking the very institutions that are meant to enforce the rule of law in the United States. Now, the one thing I will say is that these institutions are very strong and well established in the United States, so I don't think he's going to be able to get away with this. So we'll have to see. The ultimate check in our system is an election, and there's an important election coming up in November.
November in 2018, and then obviously in 2020. And yet, if I may connect this topic to what we have discussed earlier, the shareholder analysis, given the specifics of the U.S. electoral system, it seems like he did a very good shareholders analysis. So it seems like he got precisely who is disgruntled by globalization. These people in the key states that are anti-establishment, Is this something it's the political skill that that reformers in Ukraine? I mean, it's not learning from him, but how do we counter this? I would say largely successful, not overall successful, but still largely successful populist wave that goes all around the world.
Well, I do think that there is a real danger for liberal reformers because they tend to live in big cities. They tend to be connected very well internationally, but oftentimes they don't really understand what's going on in the countryside, 50 kilometers outside of their home city. And that was certainly the case in the United States, that there are many parts of the country that are not New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco that have not been doing well, where people feel that they were ignored by the elites and looked down upon. And these are the people that are now hitting back and have voted for Donald Trump and for his brand of populism. And I think that that's a problem in a democracy. The elites can sometimes just listen. They can talk to each other and not get outside of their own little bubble to hear what other people are saying. And I would think that that's an issue here in Ukraine as well, that you have this same kind of urban-rural divide. So what goes on in Kiev or Lviv, is quite different from what happens in more rural areas. And I think reformers have to be able to build a base, that's not simply built around people like them, but they have to reach out to people that are quite different from them in terms of culture and socialization and so forth.
Which we try to do with this radio station too, because it's heard and listened to all around the country. Professor, let's can we move to another region over the world? We largely covered, again from a helicopter view, Europe and the U.S. Asia, China, India, Southeast Asia, Japan. What can and should Ukraine learn from progress in that part of the world?
Well, in general, the countries of East Asia had a big advantage over other parts of the world because they got the state part of this tripartite political development puzzle correct, early on. That is to say, they had relatively modern states even before they began their 20th century modernization. In fact, China has one of the oldest states, of any civilization in the world. They were very good at bureaucracy. They chose people by examination through merit in a very well-organized system. And that's the inheritance that Japan and Korea and Taiwan and many other East Asian societies had. I think the Asian problem right now is a little bit the opposite, that China is too powerful. China has a state, a modern state, without any checks and balances. One of the very disturbing things that's happened recently is that Xi Jinping has decided to throw away this 10-year term limit that previous Chinese presidents had subjected themselves to. That was actually one of the great advantages of the Chinese form of authoritarianism, is that they had a system of term limits by which the entire senior leadership steps down after 10 years. That was very good for their system. It gave them fresh blood and the ability to renew their leadership. And now he's pretty much abolished that. And, so China is becoming more like an African dictatorship where the same president hangs on for, 10, 20, 30 years. And I don't think this is going to be good for China. And it's a very bad precedent to be set for other parts of not just Asia, but the rest of the world.
Why is that dangerous?
Well, I don't think that anybody is a good leader for forever. I think that most people, 10 years is about enough time for anybody to accomplish anything. And once they start stretching out their rule, first of all, you delay a lot of problems. You simply put them off because you can't change things until there is a new leadership. And I think people become more authoritarian as they remain in power longer. And I'm sure that this is going to happen in China as well.
There's still a lot of people here in Ukraine that look at that model, not only China, but also Singapore and some other countries there. And I remember you talking that, your phrase, if I quote it precisely, is that do not expand the functions of the state before or until you strengthen it institutionally. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, sure. I think that China and other East Asian countries have this strong bureaucratic tradition in which bureaucracy is rooted in a meritocratic system of selection and promotion. And Ukraine, again, this is part of the Russian Soviet inheritance, really never had that kind of state that is able to, enforce rules and deliver services in a very effective basis. And that means that, without checks and balances, you're going to get a kind of corrupt and ineffective state that doesn't have any accountability. And I think that's a really deadly combination. So I think that in Ukraine's case, you need to strengthen the state. And again, by strengthen, I don't mean increase its repressive capacity. I think you want to increase its capacity to actually deliver services in conjunction with the strengthening of the rule of law and democracy. I think all of these things have to be done at the same time.
I know that you teach the course now at Stanford, getting things done within the democracy. What are the key success factors? And that's my last question.
It's there's no single key to success, but part of it is this ability to navigate a political world in which a democratic politician has to use power. That's what politics is about. Power can be used for bad purposes, but it can also be used for good purposes. And what we try to teach in this is that if you are a good democratic leader that wants to live under the rule of law, you need to strengthen institutions. But in order to do that, you actually need to both build and exercise power. And I think that's the ultimate lesson that we're trying to teach.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was Professor Fukuyama in our studio. Absolutely extraordinary program that we had. Professor, thank you very much. Professor of Stanford University, one of the most famous political scientists and political economists in the world, teaching Leadership Academy for Development in Ukraine for this week, working with Ukrainian reformers both in Ukraine and Stanford and all around the world. Professor, thank you very much once again for all your efforts, and please enjoy your stay once again in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavlo.
Радіо НВ.